The movie kicks off with a guy named Chuan picking up his daughter, Fawn, from school. Fawn excitedly asked her dad to take her to a clothing store because she'd been wanting a special dress for a long time. They got there, and Fawn, super pumped to get her dress, dashed into the shop, but accidentally bumped into a motorbike rider who was leaving. Meanwhile, Chuan had a little parking mishap when his car accidentally bumped into another car as he was parking on the roadside. Just as Chuan and the other driver stepped out of their cars, there was a massive explosion near the clothing store. Despite his injuries, Chuan tried to get up to find his daughter in the store. Now the scene switches to a news agency, where a guy named Ian Wood got an anonymous call saying that the authentic IRA, also known as the Irish Republican Army, claimed responsibility for the bomb explosion near the clothing store, and they mentioned something called Phoenix. The caller also said that the authentic IRA would keep setting off bombs if the British kept supporting the takeover of Northern Ireland. Ian hurriedly told his bosses about this, and they told everyone to find out more about the authentic IRA. Ian then went to the bombing site to report on the incident up close. It was really bad, with lots of people hurt and killed. He aimed his camera at the ruined clothing store and saw Chuan crying and holding onto his daughter. Next, we see a group of guys watching the news about the bombing on TV. One of the guys got worried and suggested they leave their apartment, but the leader of the group said they should stay put because the police would be keeping a close eye on the Irish folks after the bombing. In another place, there's this guy named Liam Hennessy, and he's having a chat with his secret lover. But then he checks his phone and sees messages about the authentic IRA bombings and missed calls from his wife, Mary. So he calls his wife back, and she asks where he is. Hennessy tells her he's in a meeting, even though he's not. Meanwhile, Chuan is back home, and he's heartbroken over the loss of his dear daughter. He's in her room, grieving deeply. It's clear that Chuan is really hurting, and he's determined to find out who's behind the bombing because the police haven't given him any information. On his way to his office, Hennessy gets a call from Catherine Davies. She asks him to look into the bombing and catch the person responsible. Hennessy suggests that to avoid trouble between England and Northern Ireland, he'll use his own people to catch the terrorists who did the bombing. Catherine is a bit unsure at first because Hennessy used to be in the IRA, so it might make the police suspicious. But Hennessy tries to convince her that he can handle the situation. Feeling the heat from the British government and wanting to boost his political standing before the Northern Irish Assembly election, Hennessy called a meeting with some former IRA folks to talk about the bombing. He found out that this Phoenix thing mentioned by the authentic IRA was like a secret code, indicating that one of the old IRA members in the room supported what the authentic IRA did. Hennessy didn't point fingers, but he wanted to figure out who did the bombing by checking the explosives used. So he asked all the former IRA members to give him a list of their weapons and explosives. Meanwhile, over at the Counterterrorism Command office, Commander Bromley was checking CCTV footage from around the bombing site before the explosion. He had his suspicions about a motorcyclist who was hanging around near the clothing store before the blast. While he was studying another CCTV clip, someone from the office lobby called to say that a Chinese guy had been coming there for 5 days straight, asking to see him. It turned out to be Chuan. Finally, Bromley met with Chuan, who was still desperate to know who was behind the bombing that took his daughter. Bromley felt sorry for him, but couldn't share much because he was still investigating. Chuan even tried to give Bromley some money to spill the beans, but Bromley firmly turned it down and said he didn't know who did the bombing. Chuan left, feeling disappointed. Chuan made up his mind to dig into the authentic IRA, the group rumored to be behind the bombing. After catching a news interview with Hennessy, where he admitted being a former IRA member and denied any link to the authentic IRA and their bombings, Chuan decided to reach out to Hennessy directly. He thought maybe Hennessy had something to do with the attack, so he got in touch with Hennessy at his office and straight up asked him about the bombers. But Hennessy insisted he didn't know anything about the authentic IRA or who carried out the bombings. Since Chuan was hitting a wall with his investigation, he decided to head to Belfast to look into Hennessy more closely. He handed over the reins of his restaurant business to his friend Lamb, who was his business partner. After getting what he needed, he rented a room at an inn in Belfast. He wasted no time and went straight to Hennessy's office, pushing him to spill the beans about the bombers. But once again, Hennessy denied any involvement, even though he claimed he'd been out of the IRA scene for over 30 years. Chuan couldn't shake his suspicions, though. After leaving Hennessy's office, Chuan headed to the restroom in the building and put together a simple bomb, setting it off. Thankfully, nobody got hurt or killed in the blast he caused, but he made it clear to Hennessy that he'd keep causing trouble for him and his crew unless he spilled the beans about the bombers who took his daughter's life. In response, Hennessy ordered his guys to nab Chuan. One of his men managed to track down Chuan, who was staying at an inn in Belfast. Once Hennessy found out where Chuan was, his team rushed to the inn, but Chuan fought them off and got away. Hearing about his men failing to catch Chuan, Hennessy got pretty emotional and decided to move his family to his farmhouse because their safety was at risk. Not just that, he also called up his nephew, Sean, who used to be in the Royal Irish Regiment, to help him look into the bombing carried out by the authentic IRA. He asked Sean to team up with Bromley to catch those responsible. The next day, Chuan keeps a close eye on Hennessy. He catches Hennessy secretly meeting up with his lover, Maggie, at a restaurant. Chuan watches them closely and snaps a picture just as they share a kiss. He sends the photo to Hennessy, using it as a threat to pressure him into sharing information about the people behind the bombing. Meanwhile, Sean meets up with Bromley's commander, who suspects that the IRA might be involved in the bombing. Sean can't deny it because the explosives found at the scene and the codename Phoenix mentioned by the bombers are all connected to the IRA. Sean explains that one of the former IRA officials must have betrayed the group and supported the authentic IRA. To prevent this from happening again, they've come up with a plan. They'll assign different code names to each former IRA member. If there's another bombing and the perpetrator mentions a code name, they'll instantly know who the traitor is. This way, they can arrest both the traitor and their partner in the bombing. Meanwhile, Hennessy and his family have taken refuge in a farmhouse deep in the countryside, but Chuan continues to terrorize them, clearly aware of their location. Chuan hides in the woods near Hennessy's farmhouse and blows up the barn as a warning. Feeling threatened, Mary decides it might be best to move to a different place and stay away from Hennessy, fearing for her safety if she continues to live with him. Somewhere else, the bombers were busy putting together a bomb cleverly disguised as a laptop battery. Their sinister plan was to target a plane, one that didn't have any Irish passengers on board. Then the scene shifts, and we see Maggie meeting Ian Wood, a reporter who got a call from the authentic IRA at a bar. They're chatting casually, and Ian is taken by Maggie's charm. Little does he know, Maggie has a hidden agenda. Chuan continues his campaign of terror against Hennessy by blowing up one of his cars, injuring one of Hennessy's men in the process. In response, Hennessy tells his right-hand man to keep his family safe at a hotel and orders all his men to go after Chuan, who is hiding in the forest. Chuan, who was ready for the attack, easily outsmarts Hennessy's crew with traps he set up beforehand. Despite getting shot in the shoulder, he manages to escape. Hennessy, feeling desperate because Chuan defeated all his men, then asks Sean to take Chuan into custody. Meanwhile, Mary, who's been kept safe in a hotel, gets a visit from Sean. As it turns out, the two of them have been involved in a secret relationship behind Hennessy's back. After chatting with her husband's nephew, Sean gets a call from Hennessy telling him to deal with Chuan to eliminate the threat to his family. Later on, Mary encourages Sean to take down Hennessy. It becomes clear that Mary harbors a deep grudge against Hennessy because he ignored her brother's death to further his political career. Meanwhile, Hennessy starts digging into Chuan's background and discovers that he used to be a guerrilla fighter trained by the United States Special Forces during the Vietnam War. He also learns that Chuan lost both his daughters, who were kidnapped and killed by pirates while trying to escape Vietnam. After losing his daughter in the bombing, Chuan is left with no one in the world. Around this time, Hennessy gets approached by Hugh McGrath, a former IRA commander who's curious about why Hennessy's armory is being searched. Hennessy eventually reveals that the Semtex used in the bombing came from one of McGrath's stockpiles. McGrath denies any knowledge and insists that everything went as planned. He also shares his belief that the bombings should continue and tries to persuade Hennessy to think the same way. Hennessy agrees with the idea of bombings, but insists they should target financial institutions and avoid civilian casualties. This makes McGrath furious, and he insults Hennessy, saying that he's more concerned about his career than the IRA's goals. In response, Hennessy orders McGrath to capture the authentic IRA and threatens to blame him for the civilian deaths if the bombers aren't caught. Shortly after McGrath leaves Hennessy's place, Chuan manages to corner him, holding a gun and a bomb. Chuan presses Hennessy to reveal the bombers' identities. Hennessy, who is also in the dark about the perpetrators, asks for some time because they have a plan to uncover the traitors within the IRA who are supporting the authentic IRA's bombings. Chuan reluctantly agrees to wait for 24 hours and leaves. On the flip side, Commander Bromley makes some progress in his investigation by finding clues about the suspected biker in the CCTV footage. The biker had a noticeable scar on his hand, which was clear in the video. Then, the scene changes to Maggie, who gets off a double-decker bus and approaches a man connected to the authentic IRA. It turns out that Maggie is one of them. Shortly after, the double-decker bus she was on explodes on a London street, causing the death of several people. Following the second authentic IRA bombing, Bromley contacts Hennessy right away. This time, the terrorists didn't use code names like before. Bromley pressures Hennessy to either apprehend the IRA traitor or face responsibility as a traitor himself. Bromley suspects that their plan, known only to Bromley, Hennessy, and Sean, may have been leaked to the authentic IRA somehow. With the pressure from Bromley and Catherine mounting, Hennessy faces another problem: his wife, who spent 2 hours alone with Sean and secretly contacted McGrath behind his back. Meanwhile, Bromley identifies the suspected bomber and updates his superiors on the investigation. The alleged bomber, Patrick O'Reilly, had connections to the IRA through McGrath, and the two were seen dining together at a restaurant. Bromley asks Hennessy about O'Reilly and McGrath's whereabouts. Unbeknownst to Hennessy, it seems Bromley has been keeping tabs on him and knows that McGrath paid a visit. So, Bromley and Catherine make Hennessy an offer. He can avoid being labeled a traitor if he can extract the names of the authentic IRA members responsible for the bombing from McGrath, who is on his way to Hennessy's house. Hennessy takes a drastic step and pressures McGrath to spill the beans about the bombers. To his shock, he discovers that Maggie's name is on the list,